Today's webinar is about something that honestly can change the whole direction of your career. I have seen thousands of attorneys by moving firms or moving firms into different markets really just change the entire direction of their careers and lives. And it's something that a lot of people don't think about, but when you start thinking about it and the reasons why, it'll make a lot of sense for you today. When you relocate markets, you're opening yourself up to many more opportunities. So each additional market will have more opportunities for you than your existing market. And a lot of people don't think about this when they're looking for a job. They think about just like where they're at without realizing that being where they're currently at can have a lot of limitations in terms of your success as an attorney. So we'll talk about that today. First, I'm going to talk to you about the reasons people should look for other jobs, and there's numerous ones. If you're unhappy in your existing job, you definitely should try to look for another job. You can move to better firms, you can move to better markets, you can do all sorts of things, and we'll talk a lot about that today. But in general, I would just stress that this webinar is going to help you understand like how to position yourself for the most opportunity. So many people are limited by the markets that they're in, they're limited by the jobs that they're in, and just thinking about the fact that there's so many different markets you can go to where you can get reciprocity and where you can find a job where there's more opportunity, where there's more money, where there's more mentorship, where there's more better hours, like so many different things that people don't think about. And I would say at BCG, probably at least 50% of our placements are for people that are relocating to other markets. It's actually often much easier to get a job in another market. It's often much easier to even get jobs in other states. And so we'll talk about that today and some of the limiting factors that people have when they're only looking at one market. You know, just to start, I want to just make a quick observation, and it's actually pretty sad. So every year, thousands and thousands of people come over to the US to get LLMs. And typically when they come over, they only apply in like markets like Los Angeles or New York City is the big one. And when they do that, they don't get jobs and they go home. And conversely, like if they were to look at other markets, smaller markets within the state and so forth in New York, they would all get jobs. But thousands of people give up. They give up in larger markets and they become contract attorneys. Some become paralegals when they can't get jobs, when it would be as simple as just relocating to a different market in the state to get work. And there's work all over whatever state you're in. There's work in almost every city. Whatever, you know, if you don't want to work in your existing state, there's going to be work in other states. I mean, there is so much opportunity out there for people to work in law firms. You know, my research in terms of the firms that we deal with at BCG, and that's just as recruiters, is over 80,000 law firms. So if there's over 80,000 law firms in the country, and you're going and you're applying to like 10 or 20 jobs in your market where there might be a lot of competition, it's absolutely insane. And this is what people do. So many people limit themselves by trying to work in one market when they could work in other ones. If you didn't go to the best law school and you're trying to get jobs in the best firms in the largest cities, that's just not going to happen. But if you try to do that in a smaller market and work in the best firm in a smaller market, it would. So your self-esteem, your ability to get jobs, your ability to advance. There's markets where everyone advances, where people join firms there and they stay for their whole careers. Instead, a lot of people are bouncing around between firms, having periods of unemployment. I mean, the whole thing is insane. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. But whoever you are, you're limiting yourself if you're only looking at one market most of the time, because there's often going to be much better opportunities in other markets than if you just try to stay in your existing market. So a lot of people, you can get ahead by relocating to firms, you know, within your existing market and moving. I'll talk to you today about the reasons for moving. I'll also talk to you about relocating. But I'm convinced that one of the most smartest things that people can do when they're limited, when they're trying to get a job, is to look at other markets. I mean, there are markets right now like Texas where litigation is booming and like people aren't getting jobs in other markets, but they're applying there and they're doing well. There's other markets like Louisiana where there's just a huge demand for attorneys, even from out of state. At different points in time, places like California, even though you don't have the bar exam, can be really, really good markets to work in. If corporate's booming, you can relocate there from all over the country. I mean, there's so many different markets. Patent attorneys are a big one. Like patent attorneys, if you're a patent attorney sitting in Miami, Florida, it's going to be very difficult for you to get a patent job there. But you can apply to places all over the country and get jobs all day. But you just need to be open to moving markets. So this webinar, I'm going to talk about two things. The first, I'm going to talk about why switching firms is a good way to get ahead. I think most people know this, but I want to make sure you understand all of the reasons that you could potentially be limited in your existing market. And then I'm in your existing firm, and then I'm going to discuss why switching markets is a smart thing to do. So changing firms. So if you're not getting ahead in your existing firm, or you want to get into a better firm, there's a lot of advantage to do it. Now, you don't have to switch firms too often. Most people shouldn't. But many of the most successful lawyers I know, they start out at one firm, they move to a better firm, and they move to a better firm. And each firm is better than the one they were before. So if you're capable of moving to a better firm and you think you can, you should. Now, just a quick point that I want to make. So most people look for jobs when they need to, or they look for jobs when, at some point, when they decide they don't like the firm they're at. You should always be looking at jobs. You should always be monitoring the market. You should be looking at Indeed. You should be looking at LinkedIn. You should be looking at Law Crossing, which has jobs that aren't advertised. You should be looking at all these different sources of jobs to see if there's potentially a better place for you. And if there is, there's absolutely nothing wrong in applying if you're not moving too often, because even if you're employed and you think everything is going well, maybe there's something better out there. So why wouldn't you do that? I speak with people that are, partners in major American law firms all the time, and they're almost all open to moving firms if there's something that's going to advance their career. So these are smart people, and it doesn't necessarily matter what firm they're in. Most of them are always interested in talking to recruiters. Many of the best attorneys are always keeping their eye on the market, and you should do that. I mean, you're a product. So what does that mean? So a product means, you can sell yourself to whoever's willing to pay the most. If you're a car company and you're selling a car for $30,000, but you could sell it for 60, why wouldn't you try to sell it for 60 and limit yourself to selling for 30? So as a product, you need to think about, how am I going to market myself the best? So one of the best reasons for moving firms is you get a blank slate and you can leave your past behind you. So what happens a lot of times is when attorneys are young, when they're starting out, they often will, they won't have a good experience. Their work will be criticized. They'll make a lot of mistakes. They may not have the best brand in their firm. You can take those lessons and go to a new firm where you're not reminded of your past mistakes. I've seen people, relocate markets, for example, to get away from ex-spouses. Sometimes there's local scandals, and regardless of your intent, when you switch firms, you're leaving behind something that's negative. If you had a bad experience for some reason, bad work, you missed a deadline, you don't have, you haven't done a good job there, you can switch firms and learn from all the lessons of what went wrong in your previous firm. And so, most attorneys, and just so you understand, have had a negative history somewhere. They've had a bad experience in some firm, and they've had a bad experience when they go in-house. Who knows? But people always have bad experiences. You may have a bad experience for cultural reasons. You may have a bad experience because of the type of work that the firm requires that you don't like. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons, but you don't want to be in a place where you kind of have a negative brand. You want to go someplace where you have a positive brand and people think highly of you. So, people have gotten in trouble for things like a partner is supposed to prove something. People have gotten in trouble for just all sorts of dumb things, and then told because they made a mistake, they'll never get work from this partner again. And so because that partner is the only one that has the work, they get in trouble. So, if you're in that situation where you're not getting work, for example, or you upset someone and they're going to hold it against you, then you really have no choice but to try to go somewhere else. Why would you stay someplace where your brand is tainted, where you're not getting another work? I've seen people fail the bar exam multiple times. I've seen people fail the bar exam 3 or 4 times because they didn't take time to study. And, these are people from Ivy League law schools. And, sometimes the law firm will keep them on. But if the attorneys fail the bar exam twice at their firm and the law firm hasn't fired them, that's kind of a black mark on their brand there. So you probably want to go to a new firm. And that's a smart thing to do because people aren't going to remember that person failed the bar exam twice. And sometimes, there's just major baggage. People will have affairs at work. That's very common. People will drink too much or drink too much at a party and have that held against them. Sometimes people will make stupid work errors. Sometimes I've seen people not tell the truth about something trivial and get in trouble. And so, the only way to get ahead if you're in a bad situation is to move. And not even things that aren't that serious. So you may be in a law firm where, because of your law school, things are held against you. I mean, you may not be getting the most work. You may be excuse me. So you may be in an environment where where you're not getting the most work because of where you went to law school. There's all sorts of things that can happen. So it's just, you have to be very careful. And if you're in a situation that's not good for you, you really should be very careful. We're thinking about staying there. Sometimes you may be given sort of a type of work that you don't enjoy. So because the law firm thinks you're good at this work, or they're giving you work that's outside your practice area, or the way that they don't have enough work, or sometimes I saw one attorney that was considered a very good writer, and because that attorney was a very good writer, that's all they gave her to do, and she wanted to do other things, and so that's a reason to move. And so you sometimes you may want to do different types of litigation. For example, you may want to do depositions instead of just writing. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can happen, when you go into a firm that you don't want and that you need to fix. So, all right, so that's one reason to move firms. The next reason to move firms is that when you move firms, you can create a new history. So you can create a new history when you go into new firms and be the person that you want to be seen at. And so when you arrive at the new place, the law firm's going to have no idea what you were like, what you're like. They don't have any idea if you're too serious. The law firm, you may have been made too social. They don't have any ideas, and you can portray yourself as the person you want to be seen as, instead of being pegged as a certain type of person. I've seen attorneys who had a reputation as not being hard workers with their previous firm, and then go to a new firm and get that reputation. And so when you move firms, often because of the culture of your current firm, because of the way the work works, because of all sorts of different reasons, you may go to a new firm and be considered a superstar when you weren't at the firm before. Sometimes people will move to firms where they're the best attorney, and where they move to firms where they're considered like the best attorney. They may move to smaller firms. So there's all sorts of things that can happen when you move to a better firm. And if you when you go to a new firm, you're not held back by others' negative opinions of you that they may have had at your previous firm, and you were able to create a new history. So the other thing about moving firms too is, once when you take your first or second job, this may be your only option, or you may take it without knowing exactly what you're looking for. And there's all sorts of mistakes that people make when they join firms. Many attorneys, I would say most, when they're evaluating jobs, are only looking at one offer. And so here's what happens. They may join a firm where they find out the culture is incompatible with the type of person that they are. They may join a firm where they're not getting the type of work. They may join a firm where there's not enough work. So you can join firms that don't have enough work. And if they don't have enough work, that limits you. You may join a firm where there's no opportunity for advancement, and you don't really understand that. You may join a firm that's managed poorly. So law firms are managed. They're managed by management, and if the management's poor, then it can create all sorts of problems. I see firms all the time that are just kind of dying, and it's because of the way they're managed. And sometimes when you interview with a firm, they misrepresent the hours, they represent the pay, they misrepresent the mentorship. So when you're looking for new firms, and you should always be interviewing if you can, you have the ability to find a place where you're likely to do well, instead of a place where you're not likely to do well. Just different law firms have different cultures. And so you may wind up at a firm where you're not happy. And so when you start interviewing, you suddenly have the opportunity to see if there's places that you're more comfortable, where you think that the people like you. And you'll understand if you're going to be accepted, and it will allow you to choose a firm that matches what you want. Advancing is another thing. So again, if you move to another firm, you can find a firm that values someone with your skills and experience in a matter that your old firm may not. And so when you switch firms, those firms may have a better practice area. They may have more opportunity. I've moved people countless times that were stuck at their current firm as associates into partner roles at firms that were just as prestigious, where the firm had a demand for someone like them. Just yesterday, I was working with an attorney that was a senior counsel at an insurance defense firm. So he wasn't even a partner. There was a law firm that had lost someone, and because they lost someone, that person took a lot of work with them, but they still had a lot of institutional clients. So they were interviewing this person that wasn't even a partner to be a managing partner of an office of the firm, which is just incredible. So if this person hadn't been out there looking, this never would have happened. I've moved countless attorneys with no work or partnership prospects where there was more than enough work and partnership opportunities. I've moved countless partners who were undercompensated at the current firms and new firms that gave them far more support and compensation. And undercompensated and adequately compensated partners often have no choice but to move their careers. And when you see partners moving, a lot of times that's just the exact reason. They're moving because there's something at their existing firm, usually related to compensation or associate support and other things, that makes it the right thing for them to move. You may have an interest in a particular practice area and your firm doesn't have enough work or can't give you the right type of work, or the work's not sophisticated enough. Maybe you're doing lots of insurance defense, but you want to do more commercial litigation. And if your firm may not have a good reputation, and this may limit your options. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons to do this. And the only way often to advance in your career is to move firms. It can be one of the smartest things you can do. And again, if you have doubts about your current firm and you think that there's things wrong with it that are going to limit you, then it's a smart thing to move. Now, I'm not saying that every attorney that's unhappy at their firm should move. Some firms, it's going to take you time to learn that you're going to make mistakes that you can fix, and you're going to sometimes have bad experience with people, but you can overcome that a lot of times, but a lot of times you can't. And if you can't, it's always a smart thing to move firms. And often, if you're at a one type of firm and you want to move to a better firm, you can. So when you're young, what happens is when you're getting out of law school, the only thing that law firms have to evaluate you on is the quality of your law school, how well you did there, and that's about it. And once you're out of law school, all of a sudden you're starting to get trained in a certain practice area, and there's going to be fewer people like you. And the longer, the more experience you get in your practice area, the fewer attorneys that are going to be out there that also have that experience. You're actually going to be more marketable to better firms because law schools isn't going to be considered as much. And so the law firm is really going to be most concerned with your practice area and your skills. And there's fewer people to compete with. And so you're able to move to better and better firms, often the more experience you get because your law school no longer matters. So I've moved, so many attorneys, like I can't even count, into Am Law 100 law firms who may have been working in small, like unknown law firms, literally just working for a solo practitioner, but had very good skills in like a niche practice area, or even very good skills in major practice areas. Sometimes attorneys will have a portable business, and then once they get this portable business, they can suddenly move to better and better firms. And I've seen attorneys, even as solo practitioners, move into major law firms in major law firms after a fee moves as their books increase. There's just so much room to move, and so you need to understand that the longer you're doing this in a practice area, the better you can do. So those are some of the reasons to move, and there's a lot of them. And these are things I just want you to keep in the back of your mind. Now, switching markets is even often a better way to get ahead. One of the reasons it's better is because you're dramatically increasing your odds of getting a position. If you're looking at just one market and there's 50 in your state, which are literally most states there would be, maybe in Nebraska, but you're increasing your odds of getting a position because you're going to have access to more opportunities. More opportunities means more opportunities for advancement and finding a better firm. And moving markets is often, again, the best way of improving your legal career. And I would tell you that 50% of our placements at BCG are people that are moving markets. So it's always easier, by the way, to get a job if you're moving markets. There's a lot of reasons for that, but when you're moving markets, if you have family in the area, for example, if you grew up in, Portland, and you're currently working in Chicago, or your significant other may have connections there and you're moving there, you should always think about relocating to those markets, because there's a lot of reasons that benefits you. If you have legitimate reasons for relocating, the firms that interview are going to presume that you want to be in that market. They're not going to suspect that you may be having something bad maybe going on at your existing firm, and that's really all they're considering. They're considering that hey, this person wants to come back to this market. They're not evaluating you as much if there's problems or things wrong with you moving, or there could be problems with your existing firm. They're just thinking this person wants to come home. And the other thing that's important when you're trying to relocate to a market like that, you should always think about markets where you have family connections, where your significant other has some sort of connections. And when you're able to move into those type of markets, again, they're not looking at you in the same way. They're thinking that you're going to come to that market and be stable as opposed to bouncing around. So they think the person's moving home, their family's there, they're going to stay in this market, and they like that. So it doesn't draw attention that you may not be doing well in your existing market. You may have, just maybe having problems in the market you're in. And when you're moving back to your other market, it could be problematic. Anytime a law firm's interviewing you, they're thinking that, hey, maybe this person is getting fired or being asked to leave. So, that could be the reason that we're interviewing them. And that's kind of the suspicion that they have when you're relocating within your existing market. And sometimes they may think this person's moving because they have issues with people at their firm, or they're going to be unhappy. They're unhappy at this firm, and they're going to be unhappy wherever they go. And the firm does not necessarily, is going to be a little bit more hesitant to hire you sometimes when you're relocating in your existing market, because they're going to have questions that are related to your performance, your ability to get along with people, and all sorts of things. So it can actually be easier to have fewer suspicions when you move to another market. And I've seen that people all throughout my career that are able to get jobs in when they're moving markets, where they're actually lesser qualified than people that are in that market, because there's fewer suspicions about there could be performance issues and so forth. And the other thing just as important as law firms seem to respect when candidates are relocating. They believe that there's fewer questions about why the candidate's relocating. I just relocated a woman who was from working in New Orleans. She was 12 or 13 years out of law school. She'd grown up in San Francisco and wanted to return there. And we found a firm for her that hired her as a 15th year litigator, which is very, very difficult. She was an associate in San Francisco that paid very well, and even didn't require her to have the bar exam. And that was awesome. She's able to do that just by relocating to her home market and approaching the firm based on the fact that they may like her based on her skills and experience. Sometimes, if you're relocating to a smaller market where there's no posted openings, when you're relocating to a smaller market, you typically can apply everywhere. If you're trying to relocate in New York City, you're typically only going to apply to firms that have openings. But if you want to move from New York City to someplace like Cincinnati, when we do that with candidates, they may get 10 interviews, because we can apply them to any firm that could conceivably want to hire them. And why can you do that in a smaller market? You can do that because law firms are presuming that you're moving back there, that they get one opportunity to hire you, that you're going to go to work somewhere, and you're trying to find a job at a firm that has a need for someone like you. So it's much easier when you're relocating to apply to a lot of firms than it would be if you're just trying to apply to jobs in a major market, and you stand a much better chance of getting a job. So, when you're relocating, you're basically saying, hey, I'm coming here. Is anyone interested? And this is actually a perfectly normal thing to do. So you may be a corporate attorney working in New York, and there may be 2 openings in Cincinnati, but you could go and apply to 20 or 30 firms, maybe even more, and suddenly find yourself getting 5 or 6 interviews, where if you were in Cincinnati, you would probably only apply to those 2 jobs. So people like it when you're coming to a market. They don't mind if you're just applying without a job opening, and they're actually interested. They feel like they only have one shot to hire you. And that sort of approach may be inappropriate for some attorneys, especially from the largest firms, to do in a big market. You can do that when you're relocating to another market. And, in law firms, don't expect to hear from you necessarily if you're in your existing market, in some cases only if they have jobs. So you can do a much different approach when you're moving to a smaller market when you're moving markets than you might do if you were there locally, because you can apply to more places that don't necessarily have openings. Your odds of getting a position increase dramatically. So instead of applying to 3 places, you can apply to 30 or something or more. And law firms do interview people like this. I have a guy relocating to Dallas from I don't know where he's at. He's in Minneapolis or something like that. And he applied to like, I don't know, 70 or 80 firms that are all good. And he's gotten like 10 interviews. And he's not even from Texas, but he's relocating there because I think his spouse is from there or something along those lines. But, this is what happens. And so law firms actually like people that are moving from smaller markets to larger markets. If sometimes, big markets like New York, Chicago, Boston, Seattle, and those sorts of markets, people like people from smaller markets often. And I think one of the reasons is because the attorneys from the smaller markets are showing that they're very hungry, that they're trying to get more sophisticated work, and that if they move to that market, they're going to have a lot of more enthusiasm than people that are local that may be kind of jaded. And I've placed so many people from smaller markets into major markets. There are literally in Detroit, there are feeding firms. There's some big firms like Hahnemann and Miller is one of the big ones where a lot of people from that firm start out in Detroit and then end up moving to New York. And many times they don't even have the same qualifications that aren't as good as people that are local in New York. But I think that the firms like it, that the person is being very aggressive and trying to get a position there. In one 3-month period, I remember I placed 2 women from smaller size firms in Indiana, meaning like 15 to 20 people, into major Silicon Valley firms doing real estate litigation related work. And these people both attended law schools like University of Indiana and stuff. I've placed, attorneys from Detroit in major law firms and New York and Chicago. And a lot of these people attended local law schools, not the University of Michigan. And these are firms that candidates that got placed into these firms that normally would not be employable at firms of this caliber in those markets. The law schools weren't good enough, the grades weren't good enough, and they were really relatively unknown firms. I was talking to a guy this morning that went to a good law school, but when he got out of law school, he worked for the government for a couple of years. Then he worked in a smallish sized firm of maybe 20 attorneys. Now he's doing a federal clerkship. And he's getting, interviews at major law firms like in Washington, D.C. and so forth. And he's not from there, but he's getting interviews because, because he's relocating markets. I don't think he would get interviews that are as good where he's at. So the only conclusions I can reach from this is that law firms want people that are, often from smaller markets that are very keen to get ahead, that have a lot of energy. And I think that they prefer that. They want attorneys that aren't necessarily, that they're going to take them for granted, who are going to work really, really hard. You're going to see this as a really good opportunity, whereas people within the local market may just be kind of moving between firms. And, I don't think these attorneys that I'm talking about would have been able to, by any stretch of the imagination, get into a top New York and California firm right out of law school. But lateraling suddenly opens up all this opportunity. So if you're in a smaller market and you're a very good attorney, like if you thought about relocating to a better market and getting to a better firm, because it's actually possible and it's not something that's out of reach. If I was an attorney and I was in a smaller market, I would be applying to larger markets all the time. I've got one guy that's in Utah, and I think he went to like Brigham Young University, and he came to me and he'd worked at 2 law firms within a 3-year period. None of the law firms were that great. And he came to me and he said he wanted to go to like Houston, he wanted to talk to places in Chicago. And I mean, this is just recently, and he wasn't even like just the middle of his class at Brigham Young. And so I worked with him and he applied to a lot of places, like all over the country. And I think he ended up getting a position in, again, Houston, which is a good market for litigators right now, at a big firm, like an AmLaw 100 law firm. And even me, like teaching you what I'm teaching today, was skeptical when he did this, but I did it anyway, and it worked. So when you're switching markets, one of the biggest questions when you're trying to get a job in your local market, law firms are going to want to know why you're leaving, like why are you moving, why do you want to move to your new firm? And typically you're going to have to say something like, oh, there's not enough work, it's a bad cultural fit. Maybe I'm trying to get into a better firm, but there's going to be questions about whether or not you're going to go there and stay. Are you going to stay if you move to another market? Are there performance reasons for your moving? And so law firms are cautious when they're interviewing local candidates, as opposed to when they're interviewing people that are coming from different markets, because there's not a presumption that the only thing that the reason that you're moving is because you want to be in that market, especially if you have family there. And it's less risky from a law firm's perspective to hire someone who's moving because they're not questioning their performance so much as it is to hire someone that's local to that market. And so you can just think about it. If you're an employer, if someone was relocating, you're just thinking, wow, the person wants to be here. If someone's trying to relocate to another market, they're thinking the person just wants to be in another market. And so when you're moving markets, really all you need to say is that you're relocating because you want to be in that market. You don't have to talk about issues with your existing firm that's going to raise possible concerns. You don't have to get into discussions with problems or whatever's happening, because that's difficult. Those are difficult conversations often when you're trying to relocate locally. So you can go into the interviews, you can say things are going great at your current firm, your performance, they don't have to be suspicious, and you're more likely to get a job. It's a very good strategy. The other thing is you can choose a market that fits your goals and interests. So, different markets have different cultures. The market in San Francisco has a different culture than Chicago. The market in Chicago has a different culture than Cleveland. All sorts of different markets have different cultures, and you may be comfortable in one market and not comfortable in the other. So I work with people, all the time that were trying to get out of certain markets because they just didn't like the culture. Different people just don't like different cultures. Some people just think LA is the worst place in the world. Other people think, wherever they are is the worst place in the world, and LA is good. But, you just need to understand some people may not like the pace of New York and they want to be in a place like Atlanta. Some people, may not like Chicago and want to be in Texas. Texas has a different culture. So every market has different cultures. Washington, D.C. has a very unique legal culture. They all have different legal cultures. So even I was working with a woman that was in Chicago and wanted to be in Germany. She was from Germany. And so her family was, and she relocated there and was happy. I was working with a woman that was in South Carolina that relocated to a firm there, and she didn't like being there because she figured out when she got there that everybody in her firm had grown up together and had gone to the same high school. And it was very insular and she didn't like it. So different people have different reasons for moving to different areas and being in different markets. And culturally, you may be more comfortable in one market than another. So do you like the people in your market? Do you like the culture? Do you fit in with the people? And if you don't, or you feel like you could be someplace else where it could work better for you, then that's a good opportunity. The other thing is when you're relocating, if it was me again, and I was, just hypothetically, I was working in Madison, Wisconsin, I would want to apply to a lot of places all over the country to see if if I wasn't happy there, because you're going to have the ability, to evaluate a lot of different places and how you feel and what the culture is. I mean, it's no different, people when they're going to college, they try to choose a college that matches their what they want, who they see themselves as. And so law firms are the same way. I mean, there's different cultures within different cities, but there's also different cultures based on the city. And so, if you're looking at just firms in your existing market, you're often going to be limited to firms with openings. And so having the ability to really evaluate a wide variety of firms can help you, do better. And the other thing is sometimes people may have had a bad experience in their existing market, and they may not want to be there. They may have had, they may be in a smaller market where attorneys talk, and they have a reputation that they don't want. And so maybe you can get away from that by going to a different market and starting over. If you're at a huge market, the quality of work that's required may be a lot different than if you're in a smaller market. I mean, smaller markets often, there's fewer hours. There's the work is not for the largest clients. So it's not as, the work doesn't have to be of the same caliber. The same thing as if you want to move from a smaller market to a bigger market where the work has to be of a higher caliber. And, I try to, I want to be careful here, but, I've seen in my career a lot of people where their history, followed them, when they were relocating the same city. I had one person not too long ago in Wisconsin, and he had been unemployed, and he got a very good job with another firm, and then when he was he'd made some sort of mistake. He was a patent attorney at his previous firm, and after the mistake, he corrected it. But he got to the new firm. When he got there, he was there for no more than a couple weeks, and someone from his old firm said something to the people that hired him at the new firm, and they fired him right away. And he was literally less than 1 month into his new job, and it was someone said something to someone at at an informal social setting. So he was suddenly like got this job and he was there for less than a month and then let go. So he had a bad history in the market, and had he relocated firms markets, he would have been been able to get a job. I saw one woman, it was just so strange. She was in Atlanta, and for whatever reason had kind of been blackballed in the entire city. I don't know what had happened to her exactly, but she couldn't find a job. And she came to me, and I started getting her interviews all over the country. And she wound up at like an Am Law 100 type law firm in Palo Alto, which without the bar or anything like that. And wasn't a corporate attorney. I think she was actually like some sort of IP attorney, and that happened. So, in whatever city you're in, if it's a smaller market, then people will often know you, and you'll have a reputation, and people will say things. And if you relocate markets, that's not going to happen. Other things, that happen too is you may have gotten, such good experience, at your existing firm that you wouldn't, necessarily be getting ahead. But when you relocate to a smaller market, there's fewer people like you. So, if you're trained in a major market and you have very good experience in your practice area, and you go to a new market where there's not a lot of people like you, I mean, you're going to automatically be a star. Like, you're going to be a standout attorney in that market. And when it comes to people like are doing like corporate transactional real estate, employee benefits and things like that, even like food and drug law, immigration, healthcare, there's often in smaller markets just no one that does that sort of work. So relocating to other markets can be a very good thing to do. I was working with a partner at not too long ago. He was at an Am Law 100 law firm, and that law firm had this policy of when you turn 65, you had to retire. So he was made to retire, and he was like about a month or two away from losing his job. And he came to me, and I looked at his background, and he was this certain type of patent attorney that had experience doing optics for glass. I don't know exactly what that was. And I did research, and I found a firm in San Antonio, Texas, which is not a big market, but they had a practice doing this. He'd never even been to Texas. And I sent him there, and they thought like they couldn't believe their luck that they found somebody, because they were kind of an expert in this, and they had clients that needed it. And so he was able to go there. And this was, a while ago, and he's still there. So he was able to move to a market where he wouldn't have had any opportunities. And I think he was in Denver, to a market that needed someone like him, and where his experience was very valuable. So, if you're trying to, move markets, and you move to a market where there's not enough people like you, you're often just going to be like a complete standout person. I had a firm, I don't know, several months ago, and it was a corporate firm that had some big corporate M&A work, and it was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they had some big clients. I don't know exactly what happened. And I moved two people there. I moved one guy that was in his late 60s that had this sort of experience, that had been unemployed for about a year and a half. And then I moved another woman that was from Delaware, and was a solo practitioner that was 3 years out of law school, that had been doing work, corporate work for smaller clients. None of these people would have ever gotten a position had they not relocated markets. So I'm just telling you like the strength of this, and how easy it is, and how your whole career can change, by moving markets. I had an attorney that had been an unemployed securities attorney for a long time. He'd been trained in New York, but didn't have any work, and was able to get a position in Seattle doing that work. A very good job. I had an unemployed ERISA woman in the Midwest that, it was kind of a crazy story, but the partner she was getting all her work from was shot by her boyfriend and killed. And so she suddenly didn't have any work and was unemployed. And I got her a job with a major law firm in Texas as a partner. They just didn't have anybody like her with their experience. I placed not too long ago a employee benefits attorney from a smaller law firm in the Midwest to a major New York City law firm, because there weren't enough people like her. And she was from a small law firm. She never would have gotten that position had she not relocated. So, I also place people all the time, like people from New York City in particular, where they're maybe having a difficult time finding work in their existing market. They may be too senior, there may not be enough work in that market, but then they decide, okay, I'll look at upstate New York. So they'll look at like Albany, Rochester, and Syracuse. And these firms, they warmly receive them, and they'll interview them, they're excited about them. And these attorneys are able to settle down have families, work in markets where there's more stability, and just have often had great experiences. They're less than 20 minutes from work. They can have houses. The schools are good. So, week after week and month after month, I see people whose careers at BCG are changed for the better by relocating markets. And if you're able to do that, it can make just a major, major difference. The other thing that's important to understand too is when you relocate, many of these firms are willing to pay you relocations. They'll pay for moving expenses. They'll pay for you to study for the bar, and it can be a really great experience when you go to a different market. You work at a firm that pays you to relocate, and it's just a very smart thing to do. And the only way that this can happen is with if you're working in a firm and they're relocating, so there's a lot of employment security. I'll just tell you a quick story about myself. I was in a clerkship, and essentially, I didn't get fired. I quit, but I would have gotten fired. It was supposed to be a tier clerkship, and towards the end of my first year, I ended up losing my job as a federal clerk. I was in a small market, Bay City, Michigan, which is about an hour or a half or so from Detroit. I was working in this market and hadn't yet taken the bar because I didn't have to take it until I was leaving my clerkship. And I had two choices. One is I could have tried to get a position in Detroit. My other position was I could have tried to get a position in New York. And I decided on a whim to apply to firms in Los Angeles. And I was much better received than I was in Detroit, where there were only 4 or 5 big firms. I was much better received probably than I would have been in New York because there was so much work in California, and I moved to California, and it was just an amazing experience. But I never would have gotten the type of experience and worked for the type of firms I did and had as good of a life had I not relocated to California. So just by sending your resumes to another market, your whole life can change. So again, moving firms can be a very good career move. It can help you get ahead. It's even more helpful when you're trying to relocate markets. I've seen countless miracles of people's careers and lives being turned around by relocating to markets. And it can just be like a very awesome thing. So I'll take just a quick minute or two for a break. And then when I come back, I will do questions and answers. So I would encourage everyone to ask as many questions as you have. You can ask them about what I've been talking about today, or anything that's kind of relevant to your career. This is one of my favorite parts of the week, is answering questions, because I feel that that people can you can really get a lot out of it when you ask questions. So I'll just take a quick break for a minute, and then when I come back, I will do questions. All right, so give me 1 second here and we'll go to questions. Hi, hello?
You weren't on mute when you were on your break.
All right, let's get started with questions. 1 second. All right, let's go to questions. Give me 1 second. All right, here we go. Okay, first question. I keep hearing people mentioning join a boutique firm before trying to join a large firm. What are your thoughts on this? What's the best way to find one of those firms you work in a niche practice area? Thank you. Okay, so if you do want to work in a large law firm, your first thing that you should try to do would be to get a position in a large law firm. If you can't do that, then a boutique is a good option. What you should be trying to do when you join a boutique is you try to find a boutique that is very strong in your practice area. So you may be in some sort of IP, you may be in litigation, doesn't matter. One thing that's very interesting, for example, patent attorneys. So patent attorneys typically, when they go to college, they're majoring in sciences and things, and so they often don't have the best grade point averages, because patent attorneys typically come out of scientific or sometimes math and things like that, but generally like scientific type backgrounds. And so, or electrical engineering and things like that. So they typically do not get the best grades. And so they often don't get into the best law schools. So when a patent attorney is in law school and they're applying for jobs, they often don't go to the best law schools either. It can be very difficult for them to go to large law firms. But then what happens is, after they've been there for a few years, like at the the smaller law firm, they have the skills and they can move to larger law firms. So if you do go to work in a boutique, the best thing you can do is make sure that you're doing it in a practice area that is, a very well-defined, very niche type practice area. And if you're able to do that, then it can make it much easier to move to a larger law firm later. Now, when you talk about a boutique firm, what does that mean? The best boutique firms are going to be boutique firms that are working on behalf of large clients. So a small firm that you call a boutique, you would typically want to go to a place where it's doing work on behalf of large clients, not just a boutique that's doing work on behalf of smaller clients. So typically you want to choose a boutique where you're doing work for larger clients. Okay, next question. I'm currently working in a mid-sized law firm in Denver and have been considering to move to the Southeast or Midwest, where I hear there's less saturation in my practice here at commercial litigation. How do I assess which smaller markets are likely to validate my background from a more competitive urban market? Also, how do I approach firms that don't have advertised openings if I have no direct ties to the city that I'm located? Okay, so yeah, typically, when you're trying to relocate to different positions, to different firms and where it's less saturated, it's important to understand that, if you're trying to move to any market within your state can be less saturated. So if you're working, for example, in Denver, there's going to be fewer attorneys than Aspen. If you're trying to get a job and from Denver, there's going to be fewer attorneys in Vail. Different markets will have different levels of saturation because where there's fewer attorneys, there's going to be fewer people to do the work. And so a market like Denver, there's a lot of attorneys and it's competitive. If you want to relocate to the Southeast or you want to relocate to the Midwest, you should try to find markets where you see a lot of jobs online. So anytime you see a lot of positions in one market more than in your own, then that's a sign that there's probably a lot of opportunity there in that particular market. So your next question is, how do you approach firms that don't have advertised opportunities? The best way is to just do searches online for firms that do your practice area. So you would just say commercial litigation firms in, say, I don't know, the Midwest, you could say Cincinnati. And so you would look up all the firms in Cincinnati and you could try to find all the firms in Cincinnati that have, commercial litigation practices. There's all sorts of lists and rankings and things. And then when you find those firms, you would just find the person, the HR person, and start applying to them. They don't need to have an opening. And it's a very good way of getting a job. Like when we work with people that are trying to relocate to different markets, we'll most often apply to firms that don't have any openings. And it's a very good way for those candidates to get jobs, and it works. That's how I would say probably the placements that we make at BCG, when we apply to people that don't necessarily have an opening, those candidates are much more likely to get a job. The reason for that is because when you apply to a firm that doesn't have an opening, especially if it's in a market that's very busy, you're the only applicant and you're presumably interested in them, even though they don't have an opening. And they like that. So it's a very good way to stick out. What's interesting to me too is I had a law firm for years in Malibu, California, and for the whole time I had this firm, even though if you did a search for law firms in Malibu, California, it would be like the #1 result out of maybe 4 or 5 firms. I only received like once or twice in the decade plus that law firm was there unsolicited resumes. 2 people walked in to the office with their resumes and said they were interested in working there, and I hired one of them. And this only happened twice. And so think about that from the standpoint of a law firm. If a law firm thinks that they could hire someone and has the work, and you're the only applicant, it's much easier to get a job. And the hire that I made, by the way, in response to someone walking in was a horrible hire. And I should have known, based on what I know about legal recruiting, the person was a horrible hire. But I made that mistake because I was just thinking, this is so great, this person's interested in working for me, and it's a big mistake. Okay, if I'm moving to a major market moving from a major market like Los Angeles to a smaller legal market in another state, how do I frame my move in a cover letter during interviews so it's a strategic career choice, not as if I'm stepping back because I couldn't make it in a big market? I worry that firms might assume that I'm running for something, running towards a better opportunity. So people in smaller markets think that there's great things about their smaller market. They feel that people should want to work there. People in places like I was just not too long ago in rural Utah for several days, and people kept talking about how it's so much better, the lifestyle, the people, and so forth. They're so much better there than they are in a big city. And people do this in smaller markets all the time. So if you're applying to smaller markets, you can say that I want to work in a smaller market. I don't like working in a large market, and people that are in smaller markets like to hear that. And so it doesn't seem like you're running for something. It seems probably that you want just a different pace, different types of firms, and so forth. And smaller markets, by the way, there's so many advantages to them. One of the big advantages of a smaller market is that once you go there, there's going to be fewer people that you're competing with. People tend to be more cohesive inside law firms in smaller markets. They don't fire people. Most people advance. There's so many great reasons for going into a smaller market. Okay, next question. You mentioned that firms often value attorneys relocating to their market because they're perceived as hungry and committed. How do I reassure a firm that I plan to stay long-term if I don't have family roots in the city? Would it be helpful to mention lifestyle or personal values as my rationale for the move, or does that seem too personal and risky? So if you're moving from a smaller market to a larger market, you would just say things like, I want to work on larger clients. I want to stay at least in places more fast-paced. It's my dream or my goal to work in a smaller market. So so those are that's how I would do it. Even if you don't have family roots, if you're relocating to a market like Los Angeles or New York, people in like New York, for example, think, why wouldn't anybody want to work in New York? It's the best possible place to work. So oftentimes you don't need to really articulate that. Firms in New York just assume everybody wants to work in New York. So that's how I would approach that. And if you're trying to relocate to a larger market, it just shows that you're really trying to get ahead, trying to work on larger clients and law firms like that. Let's see here. Okay. I'm licensed in California, but I'm looking to relocate to Texas, where I know the bar rules and reciprocity are different. Should I plan on applying now while I'm planning to sit for the bar with a single uncertain new employers? How do firms typically view candidates who are in the processes of transitioning licensure? So yes, you can always apply to firms even if you don't have the bar. That's not something you need to worry too much about, but you're often going to be much better suited if you've taken the bar before applying, because it shows a commitment to working in that area. So law firms are going to view you more positively if you've already taken the bar. And if you've passed the bar, then they're going to know that you really want to work that. People, like I was giving some examples of people relocating from Detroit to New York. All of those people took the bar before trying to relocate. So taking the bar, getting admitted to Texas, and then showing you've done that is a very powerful thing. It's going to improve your odds of getting a position by several times, especially if you're like a litigator, because litigators need to be licensed to do the work. Corporate attorneys, you're not signing pleadings and so forth, so it's a little bit different. But yes, you should, if you can, you should have the bar in that state before you relocate. Some bars like DC and stuff, people can always automatically waive into, so you don't need to worry too much about that. But other states where you might need to get admitted to the bar before applying, it's going to dramatically increase your chances of getting a position if you've already taken the bar. Okay, next question. Do you recommend that attorneys signal their willingness to relocate directly on their resume or LinkedIn, even if they're currently applying for multiple reasons? I'm concerned about appearing unfocused or opportunistic to firms if I don't clearly anchor myself during one geographic area in the process. So you don't want to say that you're interested in relocating on your resume. You don't need to say that on LinkedIn. You don't really need to say anything. If you're relocating to a market where you have contacts, you would say that in your cover letter. But if you're not, you can just apply. And there's nothing wrong with applying to firms in different markets, even if you're not admitted there. It just you just do it and see what happens, and it works. You don't need to say anything again on your resume or LinkedIn. If you're applying to a firm in a different market, then that law firm is going to assume you want to work there. Typically, when you're doing that, you're applying to firms that have the same practice area that you're doing. So you want to, whatever your practice area is, you want to apply to firms that are very strong in your practice area. And typically, if those law firms have the work and you're a good candidate for them compared to local candidates or whatever they're getting in the market, then you stand a good chance of getting an interview and hired. Okay, if you move markets, would a firm still not be interested in an in-house tax attorney who wants to return to firm life? So depending on what type of tax you do, you may be marketable to law firms, but it's very difficult for in-house attorneys to move off into law firms, because there's a presumption that you've chosen that type of practice setting, prefer to be there. But yes, firms will be interested in if you relocate in a different market, if you're the best candidate, even compared to other people in law firms, and yeah, you stand a good chance of a decision. Okay, let's see here. When changing markets, how do you deal with taking the bar in different states when you're not licensed there? Should you take other states' bar exams to open up new markets? So there's certain markets like California where the bar is very difficult. So you're going to drastically improve your odds of getting a position if you relocate there. There's a lot of things you should investigate with bar reciprocity and so forth. So there's different bar reciprocity rules, and so there's whatever state you're admitted to, depending on how long you practice, it's not going to be all that difficult for you often to relocate to another market. Let's see. So last question. So if anybody doesn't have any other questions, this will be the last one. I apologize too. I'm a little tired today. Some Benadryl because I have a cold. It's totally like zoned me out. Okay, I'm originally from New York City and currently I'm a rising 3L at the only law school in Vermont. Realistically, it would be a good idea to start my firm in Vermont, or start my career in Vermont and then try to lateral to a firm in New York City or other large metro area later on. If so, when would the best time be to do that? After how many years of experience as an attorney? I'm interested in intellectual property, not patent. Is that practice very difficult to work in outside of large markets? Okay, so there's a couple different questions here. The person is in Vermont and interested in getting a job. So you don't need to confine yourself to trying to get a job in Vermont. You can apply to jobs in all sorts of different states. So that's the first thing I would say. So I don't know why you limit yourself to Vermont. And you may, New York City, I would apply to firms there too, even if you don't, just to try to get a position there, and you don't have to apply to the largest firms. You've raised an interesting question, and I think it's worth answering, and just so you understand. So if people that go into intellectual property law, that's a very risky practice area to get into if you don't have like a technical background and can't get admitted to the patent bar. If you're just trying to get into IP law, that kind of limits you to trademark prosecution, which often isn't the best long-term career path. It will limit you to trademark prosecution, and overall is something, if you don't have a technical background, you're always going to be limited in terms of the type of work you do and the size clients and things you're working on. It's just how it works. People go to top law schools all the time, and they come out and you can do data privacy, which is sort of IP, and other things. But if you're trying to work in Vermont, there's not going to be large law firms there that are going to give you the training that's going to make you the best attorney to relocate to a large market. So my advice to you would be to try to get a job in New York, probably not limiting yourself to IP. You want to take whatever types of jobs you can get. Hopefully it's doing work on behalf of large companies and not individuals, which means law firms that represent companies can do much better work, and they have larger budgets than law firms that are representing individuals, which would be like trust and estates and things like that. So you always want to try to get a position with law firms that are doing work for companies. It doesn't have to be in New York. You could relocate, you could apply to a lot of different markets. But if you're trying to just work in Vermont, that's going to limit you, and the size clients at law firms in Vermont, it's going to be much smaller, and your experience isn't going to be as good. So I would recommend not limiting yourself to intellectual property law. I don't know why you're interested in intellectual property law. A lot of times attorneys will decide that they're interested in something. There's LLMs in intellectual property law, which is very interesting. People get LLMs. They would be better off spending a year taking engineering or science classes to prepare them for the patent bar if that's what they want to do, than get an LLM. So that would be my advice, to try to get into the largest firm that you can. It doesn't have to be in Vermont. It can be in any state, and just apply to a lot of places, and don't limit yourself to Vermont. You can apply to firms in all over, in Chicago, and different parts of Ohio and Philadelphia, and all it takes is one firm to hire you that has good work, and then once you get that, it's going to open you up to more opportunities. Just as a quick kind of aside for everyone on this webinar, if you're trying to make more money, trying to be the best attorney you can, your goal really, regardless if you're a law student, whatever stage in your career is to go to firms where there's likely to be, where they're representing the largest clients possible. And that means you're going to get the best training. And it's very important. Okay, the last question. Let's see here. I am a New York licensed attorney practicing in-house and looking to relocate to India to be closer to my family. Any thoughts on how I might approach the job search? I'm not sure how to look for positions where foreign attorneys are qualified to apply. I have no idea. I don't know anything about how to relocate to India. I wish I did, so I can't help you with that question. Okay, so another question, can we contact you for recruitment purposes? Yes, anybody, you can send your resume to, you can just go to bcgsearch.com and you can submit your resume. And if you submit your resume, I look at all the resumes that come in, so I will review your resume if you send it to BCG. Okay, well, thanks everyone for being on this webinar, and I will be back next week. I think this, I hope this was helpful, because one of the things that I try to, stress in my webinars is that there's a lot more opportunity out there than you may realize, and that's especially so when it comes to, working in different size firms and working in different markets. People are so limited many times by trying to be in one market. This person that asked the question about being in Vermont, limiting themselves to Vermont, that's a mistake. Like you have to look at a lot of different types of markets. My whole life changed when I decided, just as a whim, to apply to firms in California. There was much more work there. There were a lot more firms. It was just a smart thing to do. And so you should be doing the same thing. You should be trying to find places that you can apply to in other markets where you might have more opportunity than if you limit yourself to where you're at. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and I will be back next week.